an overview of the plan for the day, and then an introduction and some guidance to the assessment. As we're going through the slides, if you have a question, either put your hand up or pop it in the chat, or stop and ask the question, and we'll answer it. We've also got a session at the end of the day where you can ask any other questions. So if, you know, during the day you've got questions about the assignment or the module, you'll have another opportunity at the end of the day to ask questions then. So what I'm going to do first is just introduce the team. So probably most of the team are familiar to you. You already know the team. So there's myself, Rhiannon Packer from Cardiff Met. We've got Alison Rees-Edwards and Nana Ryder from Trinity St David's, Carmel Conn from the University of South Wales, Di Thomas from Swansea University, Meg Hicks from Aberystwyth, Anne Hodgson from Cardiff Met with myself, Fliss from Bangor, and Laura from, I'm not sure if you've actually changed names, Laura from Wrexham or Wrexham Glyndŵr. I think you're about to change to Wrexham University, aren't you?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the team on the for this module, for this term. I'm going to give you an overview of the day today. So we've got the welcome and plan for the day, which is where we are now. We've changed the time slightly to better fit with what we want to deliver for the day. You should have already had the outline, but just as a reminder, we're going to look at core strand 1 of the module for the first part this morning. So that's between 10 o'clock and 11:30. Then we're going to stop for a break for 1/4 hour and come back at 11:45. And we're really excited. We've got a panel of experts today rather than one person. So we've got 3 people talking to you today about excellence in practice in terms of ALN. We'll break for lunch then at 1 o'clock for ½ an hour, and then we'll come back and do or look at core strand 2. Then we'll have another break for, well, 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for a recap and reflection, and there'll be another opportunity at that point if you've got any questions around the module and assignment as a whole. Just to give you a quick overview of the panel, the experts that we've got today, and I'd like to thank Fliss for organising this. It's no mean feat to get 3 people to come and talk to us. So we've got Dr. Jean Ware, who's a recently retired reader in education from Bangor University, and she's published quite extensively on children and young people with profound and multiple learning difficulties. We've also got Christopher Robertson, and he has also recently retired from being a lecturer in inclusive and special education at the University of Birmingham. He's got extensive experience of teaching children and young people with physical and/or severe learning difficulties and profound multiple learning difficulties. His teaching and research interests are in the areas of education policy, international perspectives on special and inclusive education, the coordination of provision for children and young people with special educational needs, pupil-student participation, and all aspects of teacher education. And finally, we've got Professor Bram Norwich, and he's a professor of educational psychology and SEN at the University of Exeter. His broad area of interest is special needs and inclusive education, for example, policy and practice issues, concepts and values, emotional and behavioural difficulties, moderate learning difficulties, pedagogic issues, and professional learning. These research interests include applying psychology to education, including psychology applied to special needs and inclusive education. So Fliss later is going to tell you how the panel is going to work, but there will be ample opportunity for you to ask the panel questions during the Ask the Expert slot, and Fliss will give you more information about that nearer the time. So I'm just going to go over the assessment with you. So all the slides are on Pebble Pads in the assessment tab on Pebble Pad for this module. And we've put this assessment also in a Word document, so you don't have to look through the slides to find the information. So we've summarized it all in that Word document on Pebble Pad. So if you want to have a look at that later, you can, or download it or whatever. So the assessment is to critically evaluate the provision for ALN in your current setting and develop an action plan to overcome barriers to inclusive practice. And it needs to be 4,000 words. Again, you've got that 10% leeway either way, so 10% under or 10% over. We've divided the assignment into 2 parts. So we would like you to do an audit, which is going to be around 2,500 words, and that's indicative, just so that you've got a balance in terms of the audit and the online presentation. And then the online presentation is 12 minutes. Again, you've got that 10% leeway either way, and that's 1,500 words equivalent. So don't get hung up around the word count for the presentation. The timing is more important. When we have to work out what 1,500 words makes in terms of minutes, it's 12 minutes. So that's the most important part, not the word equivalent. It doesn't mean that you need to have 1,500 words on your slides. Okay, it means that the presentation needs to be 12 minutes. So just to give you some information about what we're looking for in terms of the audit. So the audit is to identify effective practices in your setting for whole school inclusive approaches. And what we'd like you to do here is to consider what barriers exist. So you're going to be identifying the barriers that you see in your setting and how they could be overcome. And to do this, we'd like you in the first part is to give a short introduction to the audit. And here you need to give key information about the context of your discussion. So you need to give us information about your setting and how your setting operates in terms of inclusive practices, because you teach in a variety of settings. Some are in primary schools, some are in secondary schools, some of you work in special schools, and then some of you have a role where you work across several schools. So you need to give us a little bit of information about that background and your role within that setting. And then provide a general overview and of current ALM provision and the ethos within that setting, or within the context that you're working. And that needs to be around 500 words. Again, this is just indicative. If it's less, that's fine. That might give you more words for later on. So it's just an indication about what we're looking for and around the numbers of words that we're expecting. And then the second part of that audit then is to provide that overview of current provision. And you might find it useful to record your audit on the grid below. And we give you an example as a guide, and then you can write it up. So it might be useful for you then to put your information on the grid and then use that then as a template to write up your audit. And we've given an example, and I'll show you the example shortly, but you could consider some of these themes as evidence of effective practice. So we've given you some ideas here, things like person-centered practices. So you might want to have a look at your setting and think about how you implement person-centered practice within your setting. Are there barriers to that at the moment? And what you might want to implement or put into place in terms of trying to address some of those barriers. It might be that you want to look at collaboration or partnership working. You might want to look at universal learning provision within your setting, or targeted learning provision, or graduated response to learning provision, or you might want to look at attitudes and understanding of staff. And what we suggest is that you look at maybe no more than 3 of those. So you've got, so that you can really in your sort of analysis and looking at the barriers and then the ways to address those barriers, you've got enough space there in terms of word count to actually analyse that in some depth. So you don't look at more than 3. So you can do, between 1 and 3 areas to analyse and look at. So make sure that your audit is SMART, so it's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and time bound. So when you're providing that overview of ways to approach and overcome those barriers, that part is SMART, that it's specific, that it's able to be measurable. So you might need to identify how you would measure whether that approach is working and how you're going to measure that, whether it's achievable and it's relevant, and then consider what time scales you might want to put on that in terms of implementation, and then reviewing at the end of an intervention or end of a term, for example. And where possible, and this is where you're evidencing work at level 7, is that you need to draw into your discussion links to current literature, legislation and policy. So rather than it being something that's descriptive, that you're embedding it within the literature, so you've got evidence to support your approach or the ways to overcome those barriers, and that you can see that you're drawing that from evidence either with current research or legislation. And as I've already mentioned, we suggest that you focus on no more than 3 examples of evidence from your setting. So I'm going to give you an example now. So there's the version in Welsh and Gymraeg, and here's the English one. This is the grid, and again you can access this grid on the Word document that's on Pebble Pads, and you can download it and make it your own. So you need to give evidence of effective practice. So for example, we've put here sharing person-centered practices across the setting, policy to develop person-centered practice within the setting. Then we've identified the rationale. So the rationale for implementing person-centered practices comes from Welsh Government, and in 2015 they produced a framework which identified the value of PCP in supporting learners. So you've got the policy there, and there's literature within that document that you can draw upon. Identified strengths of practice and weaknesses to excellent implementation. So we've suggested here that there might be individual IDPs and one-page profiles which are accessible online to practitioners, and that they're regularly reviewed. So that could be viewed as a strength. However, maybe one of the barriers is that not all practitioners are accessing these, or that they're not using them to support the teaching of individuals. So they're not going to them regularly, they're not looking at them, and they're not incorporating them as part of their teaching practice. So we could say that there is evidence that some practitioners are using PCP approaches in their classroom. However, it's not, you don't think that this is consistent across the setting, or maybe you haven't got monitoring processes in place to actually measure that. So therefore you might think of the targets, what needs to change, and how will that practice develop. So this is where you need to make sure that what you're suggesting that needs to change is SMART. So being specific, all practitioners to access IDPs and one-page profiles and to adapt teaching accordingly. So in terms of how you're going to do that, you might think that you might have a twilight session after school where you outline what the approach is, how practitioners can access. You might want to give case studies of how that might look, for example, and then enable some discussion amongst practitioners about how that could be implemented in your setting. So how you're going to measure that. So you might measure it with observations, looking at teacher planning. You might want to add to that, could be discussion. You might want to group teachers so that they've got a focus on this, and that they work together to develop a more holistic approach to person-centered planning. You can think of many ideas, I'm sure. Then is it achievable? So you might want to think that you've got time allocated in inset sessions to engage practitioners with the process and to encourage that dialogue. You might think that that would be beneficial as a one sort of allocated inset period after school, for example, and then that you review it throughout the year just to see, how it's working, gain practitioner feedback, etc. Then to be realistic. So all staff need to be aware of the content of IDPs and one-page profiles to meet the needs of learners. So that is an expectation. So, it's a realistic one. And then time bound, that you review perhaps on an annual basis with check-in during inset sessions. So that's clearly identified the targets, and then you've linked them to that SMART. So you've checked that they're specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. And then in this next step, then you need to discuss what steps you're going to take to implement the change. And this is where you need to link there to relevant literature, legislation, and policy where appropriate. So within this section, you need to review some of the key literature and documents around person-centered practice, and the importance of engaging all practitioners. And there's a wealth of literature around person-centered practice in terms of education and more widely. So, there is where you sort of discuss how you're going to implement that change. Okay, so that's the first part, so the audit, and then the second part, I'm jumping ahead, the marking criteria. So this is where we're going to mark you. So we've got 2 marks available for this section. So the first part that you're going to be marked on is the audit of current provision in setting demonstrates engagement with whole setting approaches to inclusion for learners with ALN, identifying key strengths and weakness in the setting. So you can see the range of marks and how we're going to award those marks. And then part 2, the action plan demonstrates awareness of whole setting inclusion processes, clearly identifying necessary changes and steps for implementation. So that's that final part on the grid. So there's up to 25 marks available for that final part on the grid, where you demonstrate how you're going to implement those next steps, and you're drawing on the literature, current literature, to support what you're saying. Okay, so then the second part then is the online presentation. And that's of your findings with analysis of the key challenges which create barriers to whole school setting approaches. And then critically here, you reflect on the skills and action strategies need to engage and challenge key stakeholders. And again, as I have already mentioned, this needs to be about 12 minutes long. So your presentation should include the following points: a general overview of the findings from the audit. So that's your part 1. So you're just going to give you're not going to read out what you've written in the audit, but you're going to give a general overview of your findings. Then you're going to analyse key challenges to whole setting approaches. And then you're going to reflect on the skills and actions or strategies that you need to implement to engage and challenge key stakeholders. And again, you need to reference here legislation, literature and policy in your response. So you might want to be looking at literature that talks about change, how you influence change, how you manage change, maybe the challenges of whole school or whole setting approaches. And then you might want to use, you don't have to because we've not stipulated it, but you might want to use a model of reflection to structure your response, but that's completely up to you. Okay, so we're asking you here to use between 4 to 8 slides. And this does not include the title slide, so you'll have an extra slide for the title slide, and then we're not including within that a reference slide. So you obviously need to include reference slides at the end, but we're suggesting between 4 and 8 slides. And then you can structure those slides how you wish. Again, on the Word document, we've given you guidance around how to upload your video presentation. Again, we're not marking the upload process. So if you're having difficulty with uploading or you're not sure how to do it, then you can contact the module leader in your setting, in your university, and they can give you guidance around how to do that. So if you're worried about how to upload, don't worry, contact the module leader in your university and they can give you further guidance. But there is guidance on the Word document that's on PebblePad. And then there are 2 sections in the marking criteria for part 2. So it's the analysis of the key challenges that create barriers to whole setting approaches. So we're looking at how you've analysed that. And then your presentation demonstrates a critical reflection of the skills needed to engage and challenge key stakeholders and how that can be implemented as a whole school approach. So you can see the marking criteria there and how we've separated the marks according to the pass and distinction category. So you've got guidance there. So there's 25 marks for both sections there. And then we've got a final marking criteria for referencing. So we've got 5 marks here. So where we look at your referencing throughout. Again, you will have guidance in your institutions around how to reference. And in the optional sessions, you've got an opportunity there to, if you've got any questions around referencing, you've got an opportunity there to ask questions about that. So just to give you an overview of all the marking criteria, they're all there here on the slides. And again, as I've already told you, it's on a Word document in the PLP, so you can just download all this on one Word document. And we've got 5 minutes. I just wondered if anybody's got any questions before we move on to part 1 or course strand 1. Again,
we've got one question in the chat in terms of the assignment, and does the assignment need to be submitted in the grid format as in the Word example, or could it be submitted just using those grid headings instead?
I think it could be used. I think it might be easier for us to read if it's submitted using the grids as the grid headings rather than using the grid, because obviously that last box is probably going to have a lot of writing in it, and I think it might be a bit squashed or look a bit untidy. So maybe if you lay it out using the grid headings as a template, and you might want to merge 1 or 2 of the headings and maybe just give one as a title. So you might just want to put person-centered planning as a title and then use the grid headings. But I think it might be better as a document rather than as a grid. But by all means, use the grid as a template to help you. You might just want to put the literature in the last bit, so as a reminder of what literature you're going to be using. But that's just a guide for you. I don't know if there's any more questions.
One further question in the chat, Rhiannon. The deadline is the 30th of August. Is that still correct?
Yes, yeah. 30th of August at 11:59 or 23:59. Yeah, so 30th of August. So you are going to have 2 submissions due for that date because you've got the advanced research and inquiry skills as well. So just be a bit mindful of your time, and also not to spend the whole 6 weeks summer holiday working on it either, because you also need a break. I think that's it, is it? Any more questions, Di?
More questions in the chat.
No. Lovely. Okay, diolch yn fawr. Again, if you've got questions or something triggers during the day, we've got a session at the end of the day, and you can ask questions, you know, about the assignments at that point as well. Okay, so I'll stop sharing now and I'll pass over to Meg and Laura.